Right now, the United States and Iran are back at the negotiating table over Iran's nuclear program. On the surface, that sounds like diplomacy. But history tells us it's never that simple. This round of talks is happening under pressure, not trust. President Donald Trump has allowed negotiations to restart, but sanctions remain firmly in place, and US military forces are still active in the region. The message from Washington hasn't softened. Talks can happen, but the pressure stays. That matters, because it shapes everything. From the US perspective, pressure is leverage. It's meant to force serious concessions and avoid endless negotiations. From Iran's perspective, that same pressure feels like coercion, not compromise. When both sides walk into talks with those expectations, progress becomes difficult. This pattern isn't new. US-Iran negotiations have often started during moments of tension, not calm. Sometimes pressure produces temporary agreements. Other times, it leads to breakdowns and escalation. And that's why this moment feels uneasy. These talks aren't just about nuclear limits or sanctions relief. They're about whether pressure actually works as a tool of diplomacy, or whether it increases the risk of conflict. So here's the question I want you to think about as we go forward. Do you believe Iran only responds to pressure, or does constant pressure make a peaceful outcome less likely? This week, the United States and Iran began a new round of indirect nuclear talks in Oman. The fact that these discussions are indirect, handled through intermediaries rather than face-to-face, already says a lot about where this relationship stands. Trust is low, expectations are cautious, and both sides are approaching the talks defensively rather than optimistically. At the core of these negotiations is a familiar dispute. Iran says it wants relief from economic sanctions that have hurt its economy for years, and it continues to insist that its nuclear program is peaceful. The United States, however, says words are not enough. Washington wants concrete, verifiable guarantees that Iran is not moving closer to developing a nuclear weapon. That fundamental disagreement has defined US-Iran relations for decades, and it hasn't gone away. What's different this time is how much else is being folded into the conversation. From the US perspective, the nuclear issue can't be separated from Iran's missile program or its influence across the Middle East. American officials argue that limiting nuclear activity without addressing those other factors only solves part of the problem. Iran strongly disagrees, saying its missile program is defensive and that its regional role is not up for negotiation. This disagreement over scope makes progress far more difficult, even before technical details are discussed. While diplomats are working through these issues, the military and political backdrop remains tense. US forces continue to operate in the region, and recent encounters involving drones, naval patrols, and regional proxy groups have kept tensions elevated. This means diplomacy is unfolding alongside constant reminders of military power. Talks are happening, but so is deterrence. From Washington's point of view, this pressure is intentional. The idea is to keep Iran engaged while making it clear there are consequences if negotiations fail. From Iran's perspective, that same pressure reinforces the belief that talks are happening under threat rather than trust. Each side believes it is acting rationally, but they are reacting to very different interpretations of the same situation. All of this explains why expectations for a quick breakthrough are low. These talks are not about rebuilding trust. They're about managing risk, testing limits, and seeing how far each side is willing to go without crossing a line. And that makes every step forward slow, cautious, and uncertain. President Donald Trump approaches Iran with a mindset that's very different from traditional diplomacy. His core belief is simple. Iran only negotiates seriously when it feels real pressure. Everything else, in his view, is just delay. That belief explains why these talks are happening without any meaningful easing of sanctions. Economic pressure remains the main tool. Military options are never publicly ruled out. And the tone from Washington stays firm, even while diplomats sit down to talk. Trump sees this as negotiating from strength, not hostility. Supporters of this approach argue that history is on Trump's side. They point to past agreements and say Iran received sanctions relief without long-term guarantees. From their perspective, pressure is what forced Iran back to the table in the first place, and removing that pressure too early would repeat the same mistakes. But critics see serious risks in this strategy. They argue that constant pressure creates an unstable environment where small mistakes can spiral quickly. When military forces operate close together, when rhetoric stays sharp, and when trust is already low, the margin for error shrinks fast. In that environment, diplomacy doesn't just become difficult, it becomes fragile. There's also a political layer to this. Trump is signaling not just to Iran, but to US allies and adversaries around the world. The message is that negotiations will not happen on equal footing. The United States expects concessions first, not promises. For some allies, that looks like strength. For others, it looks unpredictable. And this is where the debate really begins. Does pressure actually create better outcomes, or does it simply postpone conflict while raising the stakes? Can diplomacy work when one side feels cornered? Or does that pressure make compromise politically impossible? Trump clearly believes pressure produces results. His critics believe it increases risk. And right now, these talks are unfolding in the middle of that disagreement, with real consequences depending on who's right. That's why understanding Trump's strategy is essential to understanding what happens next. Even with talks underway, fears of conflict haven't gone down. For many analysts in the United States, they've actually increased. And that seems confusing at first. If diplomacy is happening, shouldn't the risk of war be lower? The problem is that negotiations like these don't happen in isolation. They're unfolding in an environment shaped by military pressure, political signaling, and decades of mistrust. When talks happen alongside threats and force, the risk doesn't disappear. It changes form. The Middle East is already one of the most unstable regions in the world. US forces remain deployed across the region. Iran-backed groups operate in multiple countries. And past incidents have shown how quickly tensions can escalate, sometimes without direct orders from Washington or Tehran. A drone encounter, a naval incident, or an attack by a proxy group can trigger responses that move faster than diplomacy can keep up with. That's what worries many security analysts. Escalation doesn't always begin with a deliberate decision to go to war. Often it starts with a miscalculation. One side misreads the other's intent. A signal meant as deterrence is interpreted as preparation. And once momentum builds, it becomes harder to slow things down. There's also a political dimension that makes this situation even more fragile. Leaders on both sides are constrained by domestic pressure. In the United States, appearing weak on Iran carries serious political consequences, especially after years of confrontation. In Iran, backing down under US pressure can be framed as surrender, which is politically dangerous for leaders in Tehran. That political reality narrows the space for compromise. Even when negotiators see potential paths forward, selling those compromises at home becomes difficult. And when compromise becomes politically costly, pressure becomes the default strategy. Uncertainty adds another layer of risk. Red lines are rarely stated clearly. Each side is guessing how far the other is willing to go, and those guesses aren't always accurate. In a tense military environment, wrong assumptions can have serious consequences. This is why war fears continue to rise. Not because either side openly wants conflict, but because the system surrounding these talks is unstable. Diplomacy is happening, but it's fragile. Pressure is being applied, but it raises the stakes if talks fail. And that's the uncomfortable reality. Negotiations don't automatically reduce danger. In some cases, they simply delay decisions, while tension continues to build beneath the surface. That's why so many observers are watching this moment closely. Not just to see whether talks succeed, but to see whether they fail, and how that failure might unfold. So where does all of this leave us? Right now, US-Iran nuclear talks are continuing, but without any clear breakthrough. There's no deal on the table, no dramatic collapse either. What exists instead is a fragile pause, one where both sides are talking, but neither side is backing down. For the United States, the challenge is whether pressure can actually produce a safer outcome. Can sanctions and military deterrence limit Iran's nuclear ambitions without triggering escalation? Or does sustained pressure eventually create the very crisis it's meant to prevent? For Iran, the calculation is just as difficult. Does resisting US demands strengthen its negotiating position, or does it deepen isolation and risk confrontation? Tehran has to decide whether compromise looks like weakness or survival. This is where diplomacy becomes more than just meetings and statements. It becomes a test of judgment. Timing matters, perception matters, and mistakes matter even more when military forces are already in place. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that neither side believes it's acting recklessly. Both Washington and Tehran believe they're being rational. They believe pressure, not patience, is what keeps the other side in check. And history shows that conflicts often start when both sides think they're being careful. That's why the outcome of these talks won't be decided by one meeting or one announcement. It will be shaped by what happens around the talks, by military movements, political decisions, and reactions to events that may not be planned at all. So the real question isn't just whether these negotiations succeed, it's what happens if they don't. Does pressure eventually force a deal? Or does it push both sides closer to a confrontation neither one truly wants? And this is where I want to hear from you. Do you think Trump's pressure-first strategy makes war less likely or more likely? Do you believe diplomacy with Iran can work under pressure, or does it require a completely different approach? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely interested in how people see this, because this isn't just a foreign policy debate. It's a question that could shape global stability for years to come.